Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining me from, or even good evening. I know some people are calling us from different countries. Again, thank you for taking the time from your busy schedule to join me in this 1-hour webinar. I'll be spending the 1 hour talking with you about my experience in using acceptance criteria and or scenarios to improve the precision and details of user stories. Of course, I will also at the end of the webinar show you how Rommana ALM as a tool does both scenarios and acceptance criteria in one tool. It allows you to do this or that or both of them, because most tools are just doing, most agile tools are allowing you to do only acceptance criteria. Before I start, I am interested to know how many of us here today are actually currently working in agile projects or projects that are labeled as agile. Please go ahead and raise your hand so they can take account if you are currently working in agile project. That will help me, of course, decide how much details I have to get into. Okay, I was expecting the majority of us today are currently working on agile projects. Let me add to that also, even if you had worked on agile projects in the past, please go ahead and raise your hand. So you're either working on agile now or in the past. Again, I want to get an idea about how much details I need to get into in the user story stuff. There is still some people who have never worked on agile projects or either in the past or now, which is fine. This webinar is not only for agile, although it says user stories and acceptance criteria. The topic of this webinar is relevant even if you are working on non-agile projects. Now, my second question is, out of those of you who either worked in the past or now in agile projects, how many of you actually use acceptance criteria? Go ahead and raise your hand, and that must be a subset of those of you who said you're working on agile projects. How many of you are using acceptance criteria in your projects for user stories? Okay, so almost everyone who said using agile project, working on agile projects are using acceptance criteria, but also there's a number of people who did not. All right, we will understand all about it today, and we'll see the difference between acceptance criteria and scenarios, and should we use both, should use one or the other. That's what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to be lowering your hand now again, and thank you for sharing this information with me. This webinar is sponsored by Rommana Software, the leader in integrated application lifecycle management. And as you can see, Rommana ALM has everything you would want to do in a software lifecycle in one tool and one repository in the middle. This repository down here is a SQL Server database where you can do your requirements and user stories. You can do all the testing stuff, test management, test design. Here you can do your document management. All documentation that's relevant to the project are here. If your project is going to use use cases, they are here. If not, of course, you can ignore this component. This collaboration component is essential because whether your project is agile or not, there must be a lot of collaboration between team members. Then on the right here is the project management component. This has to do with tasks and milestones and timelines and everything. And Rommana ALM uses a very unique approach to project management. Nothing like what Microsoft Project does. It is called the feature-based project management because everything is around the the requirement or the user story. I have another webinar that I do every once in a while. It's called the feature-based project management, and that webinar only focus on that piece here. Then you have your issue management or bug tracking, if you wish to call it. That's also there. All these components are connected, and you can trace things back and forth from one piece to another. Don't forget to go to rommanasoftware.com to try to get a free trial for 60 days for up to 3 people in the project so that you can see how it works. For now, let me move into my webinar. So just in case if you have not seen a user story before, or if you do not know what it is, as we know from the Agile framework, from the Scrum methodology, a user story is a simple statement describing what a user of a system can or will do when using the system. It's all about doing something with the system. That's why sometimes I say user stories are really very much functional. They're functional things. They're mapped to functional requirements. All right? They focus on what a user can do or will do, but they don't focus on how the user will do that. But that's the way it is with all forms of requirements. So user stories are a form of requirements. Okay, so here is, if you have not seen a user story before, here is how people write it. This is all introduction to help everyone be with me. It is always like that. You say as a, and here is an actor or a type of a user in the software. For example, as an employee, as a customer, as whoever is the role of the person in the application. I wanted to do whatever here so that I can achieve something. So here's an example. As a customer, I want to be able to check the status of my order online, and that's the action right here, so that I know when I will receive it. A lot of people get hung up on this achievement part. I personally don't care much about it. I only put it there if it adds something to the user story. When I look at something like this, I say, does this help the developer or the tester do this user story any differently? If I removed this completely, does it affect anything? And if the answer is no, it does not, then I don't put it there. So please, if you are using user stories, and if you are in control, i.e. you are the person who decides what to put there or what not to put there, don't get hung up on this achievement part because it's a waste of time sometimes. Unless, as I said, you feel that part will add something to the user story. And honestly, every time I wrote a user story with this part that's called the achievement, I found that my user story is actually 2 user stories. So I tend to split it into 2 user stories. Again, I know this webinar is not explicitly about writing user stories, but I'm just giving you this hint here. From my experience, if I write one user story and I feel like I need to add this last phrase here, and I feel that this last phrase adds something to the user story, most likely this thing that's been added is actually a different user story. So I would want you to think about breaking your user story to 2 different user stories. I do not want to get into the details at this point. Now, user stories can come in different sizes, in different levels of complexity. If it is a very high level user story like this, we call it an epic. An epic is a user story that has so much details behind it. As a passenger, I want to be able to check into my flight online and get my boarding pass. All right? So if you think about this, there's so much that goes on when you go to the website, the airline website, and start the process of checking in. And just to give you an example, some of the things that can happen are down here. If you break an epic to smaller and the smaller user stories. So that's exactly how we broke a requirement to sub-requirement and sub-requirements. So it's the same thing. Even people tell you that you cannot have a sub-user story. Well, you can, but it's just called a different thing. The higher level is called an epic. The lower level are called user stories. So here, for example, as a passenger, I want to be able to select a seat. Well, that's one of the things I want to be able to do when I check into my flight and get my boarding pass. However, please note that it's not necessarily that this is going to happen all the time, because I might check into the flight, get my boarding pass, and I may not select a seat. Or as a passenger, I want to be able to upgrade my seat to first class. All right. And of course, pay the difference. Imagine if you try to put an achievement for this user story. What would you say? As a passenger, I want to be able to upgrade my seat to first class. Why? So that what? So that I sit comfortable in the plane? It's ridiculous, to be honest with you. Again, I'm re-emphasizing that it does not make any sense to enforce writing this last clause of the user story, which is called sometimes achievement or the reason or whatever. Because a user story like this does not have reason. I want to upgrade my seat to first class because I want to sit in first class. I don't have to explain it. All right. But again, keep in mind, this might not happen all the time. I may actually do this user story, check into my flight, get my boarding pass, but I keep my seat as it is in coach. As a passenger, I want to be able to receive my boarding pass on my mobile phone. That's just one way by which I can receive my boarding pass. There might be another user story down here below this one that says, as a passenger, I want to be able to receive my boarding pass by email or by fax, whatever. Okay, so these are some reasonable examples of user stories that are a result of breaking down a larger user story like this. That's called an epic. All right. Again, this is a quick overview of user stories. Now, let me share with you what I believe to be the limitations, the drawbacks, the problems with user stories. Remember, I'm a guy who lived over 35 years of my life working with requirements. Then when I started to work with agile projects, I started to work with user stories. So I know what it means to do real, true requirement management. And I try to transform everything I've known in 35 years about requirement management and requirement engineering. I'm trying to transfer this to user stories. And I find that user stories are not capable of doing a lot of things that requirements do. That's why most of the projects I personally lead, I work with both requirements and user stories. So we all agree that user stories are brief and high level, but keep in mind, as we're going to see in a little bit, we can break down a user story to a number of things. We call them acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria are a way to add more details to user stories, as we're going to see. So that statement I'm making right here is not totally fair, because it is only true if you're not using acceptance criteria. If you're just using user stories the way I just showed them to you, then user stories would be too brief. Okay. Now, here is my main problem with user stories. And I'm not telling you these problems because I want you to not use the user stories. It's not up to you. If you're doing agile, most likely use user stories, but I want you to watch for these things when you use user stories, because then maybe you can find a way to work around it. So not everything the system must do involves user. Let me go back here. If I keep saying, if I have to write my user story like this, well, how about those other functionality that the system must do, but it does not involve a type of a user? Let's assume, just for example, The system will calculate state sales taxes on every ticket I purchase. How am I going to write that? It's not as a passenger anymore. It's not as maybe as a system admin. I'd like to what? To see the system calculating state sales taxes. How about the system will assign the seat based on certain criteria. It's all the things that the system must do. I'm having a hard time writing this in this format. One more time. Again, I'm not telling you not to use except user stories. I'm just telling you that sometimes you have to tweak things around to get those things done. Okay, in my experience, I get a lot of requirements that has to do with things the system will do or must do without or regardless of the interference of any type of a user. And you know what? For those ones, I continue to write them as requirements. That's why when you see one of my projects, as you'll see in a little bit, I have user stories, I have requirements all together. And I need to use a tool that does not force me to write user stories only. I need to have a tool that allows me to write a user story, and I can also write a requirement next to it. Why? Because I have a requirement that I cannot phrase in the form of a user story. All right. As you can see also in a user story, we always say, as a user, I want to do this. It is always that I want to do this. Well, guess what? You probably already know that. There are so many things out there that I don't want the system to do. I refer to those as shall not do behavior. Those of you who have attended my courses in requirements and in test design that I teach through the International Institute for Software Testing. By the way, I have not introduced myself, kind of assuming that I am popular, I'm famous enough that everyone knows who I am, but no, that's not the case. My name is Hanna. I am actually the Chief Technology Officer of Rommana Software, but I'm also, for those of you who know me through the International Institute for Software Testing, I am the CEO and one of the instructors at the International Institute for Software Testing. But I am making this presentation today in my capacity as Chief Technology Officer of Rommana Software. Right. So if you attended some of my courses, you learned enough about shall not do behavior, which are very important things that we do not want the system to do. So it is not, I want to do this. It's not, it's something, it's, I want the system not to allow me to do this. We also know that there is a lot of requirements that has to do not with the functionality, but with the quality of the system, whether it is performance, security, reliability, ease of use, a lot of things that are not functionality. I mean, it would not be right at all to think that all our requirements are functional requirements. And that's why I'm going to go to the previous slides here. Okay, they are all about functionality. They are about what I can do with the system. All right, and even if we state some of the negative behavior, then I can say they are about what I cannot do with the system. But they're not about quality, whether it is performance or anything else, or security or reliability or survivability or anything. So when you come to express quality requirements, as they do, I suggest that you keep them as requirements. There is no reason to try to tweak the format of the user story to allow writing for writing quality requirements. I hope none of what I'm saying is taken as if I am telling you don't use user stories. Okay? Although, if you want my honest opinion, I don't see any advantage of user stories over requirements. People say, well, it is simple enough. Well, requirements can be written simple enough. If someone says this is simple enough, or this is simple enough, I can write a requirement like that. So again, I'm not here to tell you that don't use user stories, go back to writing requirements. Now we need to add some details. My first step for a user story is to take the user stories, and as you know, if you work in agile projects, we go into a discussion session. We ask questions, we get answers, we do clarification, and if your project uses acceptance criteria, you come up with the acceptance criteria. Let me show you what those are. Acceptance criteria is a list of things, list of items that you can use. The purpose of it is to establish boundaries of the user stories. Meaning what? If you look at the 5 or the 10 or the 15 acceptance criteria you write, they really help you determine what's supposed to be implemented in this user story and what's not. And of course, if someone come up with an acceptance criteria that everyone else in the team seems like, well, that's not really part of the user story, then we can have the discussion and we can remove that acceptance criteria. Okay. Now, acceptance criteria were created essentially to derive tests such that we can determine whether the developer has actually implemented the user story correctly or not. So we run a test, and some people say the answer to an acceptance criteria is a yes or no. Does it do this or not? Does it do this or not? We're going to see examples in a little bit. But what I like about acceptance criteria, the same things I like about scenarios, as we're going to see, they stimulate people thinking. They allow the team to sit down together and think about the user story and do some brainstorming to come up with those acceptance criteria. And as I said, based on the discussion, you can remove some of them, you can add some, and so on. So if this is a user story here, as a passenger, I want to be able to upgrade my seat to first class. Remember, this was one of the user stories that you've seen in the previous slide. So here are some examples. I only wrote 3 of them. It does not mean that these are the only 3. Passenger pays for the upgrade using credit card. Passenger can upgrade anytime during the check-in. Passenger may upgrade some or all the passengers on the same reservation. Now, these are things we expect to be able to do them as part of the user story. Okay? And as I said, we use those to write tests. And if the result of the test is a pass, that means that the user story has been implemented. That's why I have to be very detailed in those acceptance criteria. Now, in my experience, I have seen people writing acceptance criteria that does not guarantee good coverage of the user story. There are so many things in a user story, especially the user story, as you can see, is brief. There is so much hidden details that we don't know about. And when you work with this user story, you only can come up with certain acceptance criteria. And when you finish the user story, you find that there's so many things about the user story we did not even test. Why? Because it is not easy to stimulate thinking to come up with acceptance criteria for a user story that's brief like that. So my recommendation is to go one step further and write scenarios. I've been teaching people scenarios for over 17, 18 years. I have a process called scenario-based development and testing. All my work is around scenarios. However, when I go to a company that's heavy in using agile and user stories and acceptance criteria, and I try as much as possible to give them the benefits of scenarios within the acceptance criteria. And in some companies, when I try to do this, they say, you know what? Let's just do the scenarios, forget about the acceptance criteria. I am not going to dictate one way or another. I am going to let you decide. But let me tell you, a scenario is a very simple concept. It is any phrase you write in any format you want that represent any condition that could possibly happen, any situation that could possibly happen when the user story or the requirement, if you are using requirements, is performed by the system. All right. So you got to think about everything, whether it is possible or not possible, whether it is expected or not, normal or abnormal, initiated by the user or not. So here's the thing. Let me tell you my at least one problem with acceptance criteria. Acceptance criteria are written for user stories, and the user stories are written in the form of something the user will do. Then you're going to be limited when you write your your acceptance criteria. You'll find yourself, without knowing, you are very limited by only the things that the user can do or cannot do. Although, as we're going to see, scenarios are not about only what the user can do or cannot do. Scenarios are about any condition at all, whether it involves the user or not. That's why I don't know if I need to convince you here, but you've got to use scenarios in order to understand this. Scenarios are far more comprehensive than acceptance criteria. They certainly do. They certainly achieve much more coverage of the user story or the requirement than acceptance criteria. If you are a quality assurance person and your development team and your agile team came up with acceptance criteria, I am going to suggest that you use the acceptance criteria and you start writing scenarios. And you will see immediately that you can come up with much more things to do with scenarios than what you've done with acceptance criteria. Well, our goal at the end, as you can imagine, is to achieve what we call the highest level of requirement coverage and the highest level of code coverage. Meaning that we want to test as much as possible of the user story, and we need to test as much as possible of the code that is written by developers. And that can only be achieved through scenarios. So I gave you the same user story here, but I have written a number of scenarios, and I'm going to tell you that here's 3 pages of scenarios, 3 slides of scenarios. Okay, and if you go through them, I'm gonna just slow down here so that you can see what's the difference. So look at the details here. One passenger on a reservation upgrading to first class while a seat available in first class. Well, that's a condition, isn't it? When a seat is actually available in first class. However, there is another condition that one passenger trying to upgrade, seat is not available. It is possible that the passenger who is asking to upgrade for a seat for first class already have a seat assigned in coach. Someone said, yeah, but that's common sense. Well, not necessarily, because you can buy a ticket and you don't have a seat assigned. Okay? In which case, the next scenario would be your scenario here. First class, while you did not have a seat in coach. So someone says, you didn't have a seat, so does it mean that you don't have a reservation? No, you have a reservation. You have a ticket. But for whatever reason, the airline did not assign you a seat. I'm sure at some point of time when you were making some travel arrangements, you made a reservation, but you did not get a seat assigned. Either you chose not to assign yourself a seat, or the system did not assign you a seat because, for example, you were very close to the travel time. Like if I go today and buy a ticket to travel tomorrow, guess what? I'm not going to get a seat assignment. So now, if I go and upgrade my seat to first class, that's my scenario. So now I'm moving to a different types of scenario. I'm upgrading, or one passenger upgrading to first class, but their credit card is invalid. Okay, of course, I shouldn't be able to do that, and that's one of the negative scenarios I was talking about. All right. Now the next one is one passenger on the reservation upgrading to first class, and another passenger competes on the same seat. So you see, can this happen? Of course it can happen. So There is only one seat available in first class. I'm upgrading my seat in first class, but there is someone else trying to upgrade at the same time. And the system needs to handle that. That kind of scenario here, I can assure you 100%, you will not see it in an acceptance criteria. See, again, because we define a scenario to be any situation or any condition, you're free to do a lot of things. By the way, I feel like I'm getting into a lot of details here. That's not the level of details you normally would see in a webinar, but that's me. I'm a detailed guy. I cannot do a high-level webinar. That's really why people always come back to my webinars, because I always dive into a lot of details. I am a doer. I cannot speak on a high level. All right, so more scenarios. I guess we should get going and now tell you that there are two types of scenarios, negative scenarios or positive scenarios. The negative scenarios are those scenarios that represent invalid data, like someone is using an invalid credit card. Any scenario that represent abnormal, extreme, or uncommon condition, like the scenario I showed you, that someone else is competing for the same seat. Or shall not do a situation or shall not do behavior. Someone is trying to do something that is that they're not supposed to do. Like, for example, I try to upgrade my seat to first class while there is no seats available in first class. Or I try to upgrade my seat to first class on a flight that already has taken off. Okay, am I supposed to do that? No. Am I supposed to go back to my reservation on the flight that left an hour ago and upgrade my seat to first class? Someone says, you shouldn't be able to. Yeah, I know that, but I need to make sure that I shouldn't be able to, because it would be kind of weird, disaster, that I upgrade my seat to first class after the flight took off. I'm just giving an extreme shall not do here. All right. All other scenarios that are normal behavior, normal course of action, are called the positive scenarios. Now, here is what's interesting about scenarios, and here is how I teach people how to do scenarios. I love scenarios because I can now, if you follow someone, of course, you look at the user story that I showed you, you look at all the scenarios, and someone says, okay, but that's great, but where am I going to get time to test all those scenarios? Well, that's a good question. In fact, it's a good problem to have. When you have lots and lots of scenarios that you don't have time to test. At least those scenarios have been identified. And of course, in my scenario process, I'm going to go back here. In my scenario process, I suggest that all these scenarios should be shared with developers, the same way we share acceptance criteria. This way, at least we know that developers are going to write the code and do their design to cover those scenarios. But it is true that you may not have time to test all scenarios. When I take a user story and work enough with it, I can easily come up with at least 40 or 50 scenarios. And I come later and say, but I don't have time to test all those. Well, that's why there is a way to do risk-based testing here. I list all my scenarios and I specify these three factors for each scenario. The impact of failure, i.e., what happens or what would happen or what's the impact of that scenario if that scenario were to fail in production. And I simply use high, medium, or low. How often this scenario could possibly happen, the frequency. Is it the kind of scenario that we can see happening every day or multiple times a day? Or is it the kind of scenario that you are willing to say, well, I don't know if anyone would try to do that. If you say, I don't know if anyone would do this, then the frequency is low. If you say, oh, yeah, this happens all the time, then the frequency is high. Probability of failure is about the likelihood for this scenario to fail. Okay, and that's a difficult one. Okay, and this is simply saying, if I don't test this scenario and I let it go to production, I let the system go to production, Do I think this scenario is going to work? Of course, there are reasons to know if the scenario is going to work or not. One of them, of course, is that how obvious that scenario is from the user story. Because if the developers did not know about the scenario, then most likely they did not write the code for it. It is likely, or that has a higher probability of failure. If that column bothers you, just I suggest to put high probability of high for all of them. This number here is calculated based on these three factors. Again, if you attended my courses, this is the kind of I teach, the kind of stuff I teach in my courses. Okay, so I take high to equal 3, I take medium equal 2, and low is 1. So here in this case, it's a 3 plus 2 is 7, divided by 3 is 2.33, and so on. Here is 1 plus 1 divided by 3, it's 1.0. All three highs here, it's a 3.0, and so on. Down here, I have 3 plus 1, that's 5, divided by 3. So this number here is going to be always between 1.0 and the 3.0. That's it. It's going to be either 1.0, 1.33, 1.66, 2.0, 2.33, 2.66, or 3.0. Any one of those. And I use this as a testing priority because that tells me how important that scenario to test. If I sorted that spreadsheet, remember, I'm only put 9 scenarios here, but I'm expecting to have 40 or 50. If I sorted on this column, then I know I have, and I bring all the higher priority at the top. So I may find out of my 40 scenarios, there is only about 20 that have a really high priority. So I decide what to test, what not to test based on this. Now, there is so much details into this process about what do I do with the other ones that I'm going to test. Again, that's not the subject of this webinar because I need to have time to cover other things because I can see I've used already 40 minutes of my time. So scenarios are important because they are more concrete and more precise. They give you more details. It allows you to focus on positive and negative testing. And they allows you to do the risk-based testing that I just did. Now, at the end here, I am not going to dictate one way or another. If you're using acceptance criteria, then you could continue to do this. But I want you to know that this acceptance criteria are not achieving a higher level of coverage. This option is the one that I've seen most companies that learn about scenarios are doing. They continue to do acceptance criteria, then they derive scenarios to be more detailed. And some other projects just to shift completely to scenarios. Okay, I'm going to leave it up to you. You need to learn a little bit more about scenarios. You might want to listen to some of my free webinars on scenario-based development and testing. I have a number of them recorded on the Rommana website. Okay, let's now see how a tool would allow you to do everything I did. So this part here is focusing on the Rommana tool. And if you're not interested, you can check out now. What you see in front of you is what we call the portfolio screen, and everyone here is a project. So let me open this project here. When you open a project in Rommana, the first thing you get is this nice dashboard that tells you everything you want to know about the project. This dashboard is configurable. You can configure it any way you want by selecting what you want to see or what you don't want to see. So this shows me test execution by status. If I scroll like that, it shows me issues by status. It shows me issues by priority, whatever. And I can change what's here. All right. The nice thing about it is that every report here. So here, for example, the left and the right banners are mainly for tables. So here is latest user stories that have been added to the project. These are opened issues right here. Anything on any screen in Rommana is clickable. Okay, if I click here, for example, I can see this issue. Okay, right there, like that. Very, very simple and quick. That gives me that open issue to see what it is, and so I can close it. If I am on a chart like that, and it tells me that, for example, about 12.8% of my test cases have failed, I click here. It gives me the list of those test cases, and they're here, and I can look at them, and I can address any one of them. So that's just to let you know. Anything is clickable. Let's move on. Everything is in the top menu right here. So let me go to user stories. The first thing you see here, because as I said earlier, user stories are not very good for quality and other things. So I've broken down my user stories to functional, to quality, to anything I want, usability, hardware requirements. Someone says, are these user stories or requirements? Well, if I have a hardware requirement, I don't know how I write it in a user story. It's rare. Rommana is not a user story tool. Rommana is an ALM tool, and this component of it is what I refer to as requirement management component. The requirement management component allows you to do user stories, to do quality requirements, to do hardware requirements, implementation constraints, and anything. And by the way, you can expand on any one of those. And by the way, this list is changeable, is configurable. You can come and say, well, I have something called FDA regulations, for example. I want to add them. So you configure it, and you have a group. Here I added this, one here just as an example. But you can add. We call those, by the way, categories. Those are categories of requirements. Categories of requirements, functional. But you can see here, I have a number of user stories. But I also have something here that's not even a user story. By the way, what you're looking at is an actual or a snapshot of a project in Rommana ALM itself when we were developing the tool. And these actually the requirements or the features that were added to release 10.3. So here, I wanted to write, and I'm the one who wrote those, by the way. I wanted to write to my developers that I need to add more attributes for issue reports. Issue reports, as you know, is one of the things that Rommana ALM does. And I wanted to tell them I need to add more attributes, okay? How am I going to write this as a user story? I found it much easier to write it as a requirement without the restrictions of the user story. So it was there as a requirement, okay? And so now let's look at any one of these user stories. Let me look at the first one here. What you see in front of you is the same screen that you see in requirements and or user stories. So on the right-hand side, these are the details of the user story. Okay. Now, you find that here for this user story, I did not write any acceptance criteria. It says as a user, I'd like to export the requirement details report to Excel. That's one of the features. So because this user story is very brief, as you can see, the developers and the testers added how many scenarios? I'm sorry, the number was there. I didn't look at it. 12 scenarios out here. And this is not just not because I told you, this is a snapshot of the data at some point. I can assure you this user story now has over 60 or 70 scenarios. But at the time we took this snapshot of the database, it had 12 scenarios. Okay, so let's look at any scenario. Export requirement details report by parent to child. Well, one of the forms of the report is to organize requirements in the form of parent to child relationship. Okay, so this is a scenario. As you can see, this is a scenario screen, and it has the risk stuff here. And if you don't want to do this, you can ignore that. The only thing that's required here, as you can tell, is the scenario name and the scenario type. The number is assigned automatically by the tool. Okay, it's a 5-digit number, as you can see. When you create scenarios, it assigns this number, so that's not editable. But here you have to say what type it is, and we're making some changes in this area here. But this is what we call, it's just a narrative scenario. Actually, it is. So the default is undefined, but I can come here and say narrative. Okay, narrative means it's just written in English. And that's the scenario right here. Run requirement details report and list requirements in parent-child hierarchy, and then export it to Excel. That's the scenario. It's written in a very free format. It's something that a user can possibly do. Now, a scenario also have expected behavior, which acceptance criteria normally don't. When we write acceptance criteria, we don't write expected behavior. So the purpose of the expected behavior here is to help us write the test cases. This is not a test case yet, so the requirement should list in a parent hierarchy on the exported report. Now, of course, there's all other attributes, but look down here. I have my test cases down here. So I create test cases for scenarios. Down here, I have 2 test cases. You can see that, but they are ad hoc tests. Again, in Rommana ALM, we believe in formal test cases that are designed, and we believe in exploratory or / ad hoc test cases. And I have 2 test cases here. The red one means it's failed, and this is not executed yet. If it is in blue, it's not executed yet. If it is in green, so if I go here, okay, I made some changes, so it's not letting me leave without saving, which is fine. So going down here to the test case, and remember that's an exploratory test case. The tester found it as he was working, so that test case has not been executed yet. And if I execute it and say, well, it did not work as I expected, so I'm gonna say it to fail. Let me save now. Now you find that Rommana ALM tells you that you really need to create an issue report. You cannot set up a test case to fail without having an issue report. And says, do you want to create the issue report now? If I say yes, guess what? Rommana ALM goes and they create the issue report for you. And it takes the description of the test case and put it here. And it allows you to add here steps to reproduce, because that's going to be an issue report. So I can put whatever I want here. And it allows you here to specify the priority of this. So I'll say critical, because the failure was huge. And what type of problem with that? Is it a bug? Is it something that you expect is not, whatever it is, performance, usability, or anything else you can add? By the way, all the attributes in Rommana ALM are configurable. So let me see, this is a bug, okay? And now I'm not gonna add anything here. Let me save, or some required. Okay, I guess what you see down here is a custom attribute. I did not remember it because it's not one of the essential attributes. Rommana ALM allows you to add custom attributes to any entity within Rommana. So, you know, during my demos, I added this custom attribute. I called it a cause, and I made it a required. So I have to put something here. So I say, I do not know what the cause of this bug report is. Remember, this is required field. So I could go back to the configuration and say that cause is not required, for example. Now let me save, and that will show me the 2 test cases. How are we doing with time? I have 6 minutes left. Oh, by the way, I did not. Let me see if I have any questions there from anyone. How does the use of behavior-driven development jerkin given when then format in place of as a user, I want to do this. Okay, Christopher, your question is has a lot of details. Does Rommana come with? Okay, so the question here simply says there are tools, there are methods that follow certain format. Like, for example, when people write user stories, say, as a user, as a customer, I want to do this. Or when people write some acceptance criteria, they say, given so and so, when this happened, then this. This is another format. Explicitly, Christopher, explicitly, I decided that Rommana should not restrict people to any format. There is no point of it. As I told you earlier, I don't know if you were with me from the beginning of the webinar. There's no point of restricting myself to a format, for example, like the user story. Now, you said behavior-driven development, Jerkin, and behavior-driven development uses just those format of, like, again, given, when, given so and so, when this happens, then we should see that. No, Rommana does not have a template like that, and Rommana does not want to use templates like that. Why? Because when I let you write your scenarios in a free format, I mean, of course, when you write your user story, you can use the format as a user. I want to be able to do this, but it's not even restricted. As you can see, when we looked at the requirements, there are some user stories that are written in this format, and they're called the user stories only because they're using the format of the user story. Okay, but I want you to be able also to write something else in any free format you want. Okay, so Rommana has been architected. Honestly, being the chief technology officer, initially I was actually the product owner, the product manager. Then I became the chief technology officer, and I have implemented really my 40 plus years of experience in requirement management and test management. So I know certain tools use certain templates, but having seen that those templates, if you use Rommana, you'll say, huh, what do I use? What do I need templates for? All the freedom is right here. I'm just looking. I'm gonna move this window here. So if I go to the project and I go here to project activities, okay, here is everything you can do with the project. For example, I can go back to my project and edit the project itself. And right now, it tells me that, for example, this project is using an agile methodology. If I say, no, this project, right in the middle of the project, just to show you how flexible it is. After you started the project already, you can actually change your methodology, and you say, and you see what happened right away? Once I change it here, initially, I had those sprints right here. If the project is going to use non-agile methodology, there is no sprints anymore. But that's not the only thing that's changed. Let me save. And now I don't have user stories anymore. I have requirements. Now, let me go back to the requirement screen that we were just looking at. Okay, and let's look at the same user story I was looking at. Wow, what happened here? So I got the details. I got this there. The software is not going to change this to me. That's how I wrote my requirement/user story. It's there. But now here are all the details that I had provided with that requirement when it was written. When we decided to do Agile, those details were hidden. And the only thing that was there is the acceptance criteria. So that's about it. It's giving you the flexibility. Don't forget to fill out the evaluation form of this webinar when you get it. Would love to have your feedback. If you are interested, please go to the Rommana website to get a free trial on. So the software, if you look at packaging and the pricing, by the way, the pricing have been set up to allow everyone to use ALM tool. You don't have to spend so much money like what you spend on other tools to use ALM. You can buy them you can buy Rommana in packages. You can just take the the requirement piece, which is a user stories, everything we've seen today is 20 $20 per user per month, or 25 if you're going to use it in the cloud. If you're going to use it in our own cloud, then it's 25 user per month. Otherwise, you can take the software and install it in your server, and it's $20 per user per month. I just had to go through this because when I demo everything about Rommana, people say, well, yeah, but that's an expensive tool, without even looking at the price. This is not a price at all. You can even then you can potentially a year later say, okay, now I need to be able to do test design and test management, so you can add this component here, and your price would increase per month, and so on. The complete Rommana package is right here. It's 150 user per month if you want to have all the pieces, all the 8 components of Rommana. Please go ahead and make sure you get a free trial. You get 60 days of trial, and it allows you to have 3 people in the team so that you can use the different features. Thank you again for your time, and I hope to see you in other webinars.